Hello. Today's book is Principles and Practice in Second Language Acquisition by Stephen D. Krashen. Right, so a lot to talk about today. First of all, Krashen is probably, I think, maybe the most famous name in second language acquisition. And because I don't know who's watching this video, I'll just go as basic as possible. Second language acquisition means the process of learning another language. I'm using learning here in the general sense. Krashen makes a distinction between learning and acquisition, but I'll get into that later. So, Krashen became famous in the late 70s and 80s. He was, I picked up this factoid from the TEFLology podcast. Apparently, Stephen Krashen was at one time the only linguist who was so famous he needed his own agent, or only applied linguist. His ideas were really big in the 80s, and not always, he was very influential, but not everyone agreed with him. In fact, I think probably just as many people disagree with him as agree with him, but he's kind of set the terms of the debate. An analogy I sometimes make, I don't know if this is 100% apt or not, but I think of him as like kind of Sigmund Freud. I mean, Sigmund Freud is the biggest name in the field of psychology. Not because everyone agrees with his theories. A lot of people in psychology completely disagree with Freud, but his theories have kind of set the terms of the debate. It's kind of whether or not you agree with Freud has kind of been the major kind of debate within psychology. I think in applied linguistics or second language acquisition, whether or not you agree with Krashen has kind of been the main debate in the last kind of 30 or 40 years since he first started publishing in the late 70s, early 80s. So this is actually not the first book I've read by Krashen. I read 2 years ago a book called The Natural Approach, which is by Stephen Krashen and co-authored by another guy, Tracy Terrell. And I read that book in part because it was part of the recommended reading for the Distance Delta course I was doing. This book here popped up on another Delta reading list, different Delta lists of different books. So they recommended Principles and Practice in Second Language Acquisition. Having read both books, as far as I can remember, and The Natural Approach was kind of a couple years ago, as far as I can remember, they're pretty much the same. The same kind of theories and methodology is kind of laid out in both of them. The difference, I think, is maybe The Natural Approach spent a bit more time talking about how you would practically do this in a real classroom, whereas this is kind of mostly based on just kind of justifying the theory and the methodology and kind of, the research, what the research shows, what the comparison studies have shown. So, what are Krashen's theories? Krashen believed that we do not acquire a language from, let me back up. Krashen believed that he made a distinction between learning and acquisition. And this is kind of somewhat, part of the problem with linguistics, especially applied linguistics, is the terminology is a mess. It differs from writer to writer what they're talking about. But in Krashen's view, the distinction he makes is that learning is kind of consciously learning the grammar rules, and acquiring is kind of like knowing a language, like the ability to kind of speak a language without thinking about it. And Krashen says these two never meet. So you can study grammar rules in school, but that will never actually help you kind of speak the language. The only thing that helps you acquire the language is getting input in the language. So just by listening and reading a lot and having conversations maybe, you're getting a lot of input, and that input is kind of what makes you learn the language, not studying the grammar rules. So this is obviously a big change from the way grammar is traditionally taught. The grammar translation method, which was kind of popular, like, you know, the old school method, right? Where you have a passage and you need to kind of translate it or kind of learn the grammar rules and do exercises in the workbook. Krashen says that doesn't help at all. Also, the audiolingual method, which was popular within certain circles in the United States in kind of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Krashen, audiolingual is kind of orally drilling sentences, like repeating after the teacher several times or repeating after the tape several times. Krashen said that doesn't help you learn the language. The only thing that makes you learn the language is just by hearing it or reading it. And he's got a number of caveats with this. First of all, it has to be comprehensible. So you can't just kind of be out in the streets and kind of hear all this noise and acquire the language. You have to kind of understand what you're hearing. Now, the obvious problem is, if you don't know the language, how can you understand it? But Krashen says, you know, in the early stages, you can understand it if you have kind of, if you have help. So, you know, like a sympathetic interlocutor, somebody who's kind of talking down to you and, you know, I think the comparison he makes is the way a mother talks to her child, kind of very simply, very kind of slowly, and just kind of demonstrating everything. The help of extra linguistic cues where you're kind of pointing to stuff or visual aids or anything like that. All of those kind of help you understand the language, and then by kind of understanding the language, you're acquiring the grammar as you kind of hear it. But it has to be comprehensible. You have to be interested, and you have to be interested in it, or engaged with it in some level. You know, you can't be tuning it out. And then Krashen also has this idea called the affective filter, which is the idea that when you're in any kind of high anxiety state, your brain just kind of puts down this filter in which the language is just not getting in. So you have to be just kind of relaxed, and you have to be kind of focused on the message and not the grammar, not the language itself. And then you kind of acquire the language. It's interesting, and it makes some sense. It's completely different than obviously the way we study language in school, and kind of, I guess, the way we often think about learning language as kind of learning bits and pieces, and then it all kind of comes together, memorizing vocabulary lists and kind of grammar drills and stuff like that. Krashen, he doesn't say this anywhere in the book, but something I've picked up watching videos of him is he'll frequently reference Chomsky. And then something I've heard other people say is that his theories are kind of based on Chomsky's theories of universal grammar. And I don't know. I might be wrong here, but assuming there's a connection between Krashen's theories and universal grammar, then Krashen, I guess, believes with Chomsky that the human brain has a language acquisition device, something we have kind of a biological inheritance, that we're predisposed when we kind of hear language. Our brain is kind of predisposed just to kind of figure out the grammar on its own. So if you just kind of hear enough of it, your brain will kind of sort out the grammar by itself. I think maybe that's the theory underlying his ideas, although it's not anywhere in the book. But another thing that could easily work with his theory, I guess, is I think it's called the connectivist approach. The idea is that, you know, if just by hearing a lot of language, your brain just kind of starts to recognize patterns. The way kind of some things just kind of sound right is because you're just kind of used to hearing the words in those patterns, where some things just sound wrong. But regardless, I guess, either way, what the theoretical logic underpinning the theory is, The idea is that you just learn language by the input. Krashen doesn't even think that speaking or writing have anything to do with learning the language, at least not directly. Speaking indirectly helps you learn the language because when you speak to someone, if you're having a conversation, they will talk back to you, and so it's a way of getting more input. Speaking to somebody encourages them to talk to you, and you get more input that way. But the speaking itself doesn't help you to learn the language at all. So if you're a language teacher, there's really no point in forcing the students to speak. Krashen says they'll speak when they're ready to speak. Just kind of leave them alone, don't make them speak. The important thing is that they're just listening, or they're reading, or they're somehow engaged with the input. He lays out kind of 5 hypotheses at the beginning. The first one is the distinction between acquisition and learning. So anything that you consciously study will never be truly acquired. He also talks about the natural order hypothesis, which Krashen's been a big proponent of this. But I don't think, I could be wrong, I don't think the natural order hypothesis originated with him. I think this is kind of something that was kind of being discovered around this time. Anyways, I've seen this in other books without Krashen's name attached to it. Natural order hypothesis is kind of a accumulation of a series of studies about how people learn languages. And they found that there's an order in which the grammar morphemes emerge. So you can see kind of up at the top here, the first thing you learn is the ing possessive, the ing progressive, the plural, and then the copula, the to be, is, am, are. And then kind of all the way down, kind of the last things you learn are the regular past, the third person singular s, and the possessive s. Of course, I think anytime you talk about the natural order, you need to make a disclaimer. This is what we know so far. There are lots of other grammar morphemes that kind of haven't been put on this order, but these are the ones that linguists have been able to discover so far. And what's interesting about the natural order is this kind of pops up regardless of what the teacher teaches. So you can teach them the third person singular s kind of on the first week, but they're not actually going to be able to start using that until all these other things have fallen into place first, for whatever reason. Just seems to be the way the brain is kind of pre-programmed to learn languages. Now, Krashen makes a big point about this in this book. The natural order only applies to kind of real-time conversation, where you don't have time to kind of focus on the rules. So Krashen says, okay, if you have time to focus on the rules, like if you're doing like a paper and pencil test, then the conscious rules that you've kind of learned in grammar class can apply. But if you're having a real-time conversation, you don't have time to apply those conscious rules that you learned in grammar class. So then the only thing that's working is the acquired system. And again, Krashen believes that the acquired system you only get from listening to input. And then the acquired system, you cannot use the third person singular s in the acquired system when you're still a beginner. All these other things have to fall into place. But speaking of the conscious rules, Krashen has this idea called the monitor hypothesis. So it's the idea that you have an acquired system, and the acquired system is what helps you to speak first. So as soon as you kind of start talking, or as soon as you kind of formulate in your mind what you want to say, the immediate thing that comes out is the acquired system. But you have some knowledge of the grammar rules kind of in your conscious brain, and perhaps you have time to use them. If you have time to use them, you can kind of edit what you're saying in real time. If the rule is simple and if it's easy to use, and if you have some time to kind of think about what you're going to say, then you can use the monitor. Krashen also believes that, of course, you use a monitor and paper and pencil tests, and you use it to some degree in writing. Although it's interesting, he cites a lot of studies in here, and when students are writing an essay, apparently they're not using the monitor because they go right back to this kind of natural order here. Even though they can do the rules in a paper and pencil test, if they're writing a long essay, they tend to kind of revert to this order. Presumably because, you know, this is all supposition, I guess, but right in the middle of a long essay, you know, you're so focused on what you're writing at that point, you're so focused on the meaning, that you've kind of forgotten about the grammar rules at that point. You kind of remember the grammar rules if you're doing like discrete item testing, like, you know, number 1, you circle the correct verb, something like that. But when you're writing a long essay, most people just stop focusing on the rules. And then the effective filter is his other hypothesis, and then the input hypothesis, that you kind of learn all this language just by input. Krashen does not believe in what is known as a skill acquisition hypothesis. So the skill acquisition, it kind of, I guess, associated with maybe the audiolingual method or drilling, where if you practice something enough and you practice it and practice it and practice it and practice it, you will eventually get to the point where it's automatic and you don't have to think about it anymore. And then because you don't have to think about it anymore, then you've kind of acquired it and you can kind of speak without even thinking about it. Now this is interesting because a lot of us, when we're learning a language, we kind of think that what we're doing is practicing something until we don't have to think about it anymore. This was my case when I was learning Japanese, when I was living in Japan and studying Japanese. I felt like what happened is that I would learn a rule from the textbook. Then I would do some exercises in the textbook, and then because I was living in Japan, I'd kind of go out and speak. And the first few times I was speaking, it was just very slow and very painful, and it took me forever to remember what I wanted to say. And then gradually, I was able to remember it quicker and quicker, and I could think of what I wanted to say quicker. And then eventually, I didn't even have to concentrate on the grammar that much. It just kind of became automatic. The vocabulary became automatic. So it felt like this was skill acquisition, that what I was doing was kind of practicing something over and over and over again, at first kind of very slowly and badly, but then it became more and more fluent until I got to the point where I didn't even have to think about it anymore, and at that point, that grammar point was acquired. Now Krashen says, Krashen doesn't believe in the skill acquisition hypothesis. So what Krashen says is, it seems like you're practicing it until it's acquired. But what's really happening is, while you're practicing it, or while you think you're practicing it over the period of like 2 weeks or however long it takes you, at that same time you're practicing it, you're getting input. Because, you know, you're living in the country. In my case, I was living in the country. You're talking to people. You're getting all this input. And it's over the 2 weeks of getting the input that you actually acquire that grammar point. And then it just kind of, you have the illusion of it lining up with your practicing. You're like, oh, I've practiced that one so much, it's kind of automatic now. But actually, that's just an illusion. What's happening is you've really been getting the input. And I kind of thought about that, and I thought, I wonder, because like it does seem a bit like that magical point where you get to a grammar item where you don't really have to think about it anymore. You never really kind of know when you're getting to that point. Like the moment something conscious becomes unconscious. I mean, who knows what's going on in your brain? It's not like your brain is telling you, oh, right, today you're no longer using this rule consciously, you are now using it unconsciously. Like, it's such a gradual process that, I don't know, maybe it is because you're just kind of getting the input. My personal theory, my personal views, I'm going to add in my personal views with this. I I think skill acquisition can work. I mean, why not? Well, I mean, why couldn't you practice an item until it becomes kind of unconscious? At book club, we did this at book club. Somebody made that point. They said, well, why wouldn't language be like any other skill, where you just kind of practice it until you don't have to think about it anymore? Now, the reason that language wouldn't be like any other skill is if you take the Chomskyan view of it, that we kind of have a biological predisposition to grammar given enough input. But if you're not a Chomskyan, then yeah, why wouldn't language be like any other skill? So I think skill acquisition can be part of the mix. But that being said, I am enormously sympathetic to Krashen. I think to get any kind of fluency in a language, like if you just want to take high school French and kind of pass the grammar test at the end of the year, you don't need to worry about it. But if you have any ambitions to become fluent in a language, I think getting lots of input and lots of comprehensible input is 95% of the battle. That's like 95% of it. So in that respect, I guess maybe I could consider myself a Krashenite. I do think there's that other 5%, because I do think even after getting all that input, you still need to kind of sand off the edges to kind of polish up the grammar. And I think that can be done through kind of conscious rules, and I think that can also be done through skill acquisition, kind of drilling and stuff like that. But I think Krashen's got like 95% of it. What you need to do is just get tons of input. And just kind of, I'm diverging slightly from the book here, but just kind of on a personal note here. The previous school I taught at, the lead teacher at that school was very into kind of extensive reading. It would read kind of stories with his class, kind of every lesson. They read through kind of a storybook. And I observed him one day, and he said, just watch this. Just look at how interested they are in the story. So they each had a reader, and he put on a CD, and they kind of read along with the CD as they were listening, and it was called Monster House. And he told me before, he said, because like they were kids, so they were kind of goofing off and kind of like being naughty and stuff like that. But he says, once the story starts, watch them. They won't make a sound. And I watched them, and he was right. Like once that story started, they were just completely absorbed in the story. They were listening, they were reading it. Now, of course, anyone who teaches kids knows that getting them involved in the story is touch and go. Some stories they really like, some stories they don't. But if you can get a story that grabs their interest, they are completely absorbed in it. You don't need to say, okay, shut up and listen. Like they will just shut up and listen by themselves. And he said to me, he said, people don't learn a language because they want to study grammar. People learn a language because it's about communication and it's about stories is what we use language for. And that really kind of stuck with me, and that's been kind of one of Krashen's views as well. Not so much in this book, although it's here a little, but in other kind of videos, speeches, and interviews he's done. Krashen says, I don't believe in this idea that you drill and you drill and you drill and you drill and you drill, and then someday you can get to the point where you can read stories. He says, read the stories now. Like, have the fun with the language now. And then have the fun with the language as you learn. Now, of course, as a beginner, your access to literature in that language is limited, but if the teacher can help kind of break it down for you, or if you can get kind of graded materials, get into stories as soon as you can. Or, movies and television or whatever. Just, I mean, not only is there lots of input, but that's what it's all about, really. And also, most people are not going to get to 100% native speaker fluency level. I mean, a lot of native speakers aren't quite at like native speaker fluency level, right? So like, if you have this idea that reading literature in the language or watching movies in the language is something like you're going to get around to once you finally get fluent, yeah, you're never going to get there. So just kind of start reading stories in the language now, or start watching movies in the language now. And that thing I got from that lead teacher back at my previous school, kind of plus the theories of Krashen, which I'm largely sympathetic to, 95% sympathetic to, has really influenced my teaching the past couple of years. I've been doing a lot of storybooks in my classrooms, and I've been doing a lot of movies in the classes, which I do my best to kind of help the students get language out of. Like, I don't just turn on the movie for 30 minutes. I've got all these worksheets and stuff that go with the movie. And poetry, I've been using poems in the classroom. Songs, of course. I mean, every English teacher uses songs in the classroom, but I've been trying to do a lot of that. And all of that is because I'm very kind of sympathetic to Krashen's input hypothesis. But again, to come back to my point of disagreement, I don't think the input itself is enough. I think it's 95% of the battle. But then I think you do need to kind of come in and sort out the grammar. And there are case studies. Well, there are case studies, and there are also large-scale studies, which seem to indicate that input alone is not enough for many people. There was this famous study of this 33-year-old Japanese guy in Hawaii named Wes, who was living in Hawaii and having conversations with native speakers all the time. Had a very positive outlook towards the language, really wanted to kind of meet a lot of English speakers. And over 3 years, his grammar just did not improve at all. Terrible grammar, lots of mistakes. And then there have been studies of kind of French immersion schools in Canada, which these are schools where like English-speaking kids kind of study in French the whole day. So the teacher is speaking French to them. And they make enormous progress, which again is, to say that Krashen's ideas are 95% of the battle, but they still have grammar problems. So, you still need maybe somebody to come in and kind of work with those rough edges on the grammar, and, maybe some skill acquisition, maybe kind of drilling and habit forming. Why not? So, yeah. I guess that's my kind of personal view mixed with kind of my interpretation of the research. That being said, actually, reading this book, Krashen really does make a very strong argument for his case. He talks about cases of non-native speakers who have studied English grammar for years. One woman he talks about is even a trained linguist, and in free conversation she just cannot she just makes all these grammar mistakes. She knows the rules. She's a linguist, so she knows the rules, so she can do it on the pen and paper test, but she just cannot control it in free conversation. And Krashen says, look, if she can't do it and she's a highly trained linguist, then what hope does the normal student have? He says you can't expect them to speak without mistakes, and as a teacher you shouldn't be correcting all their mistakes because it doesn't do any good. He says you just have to wait for them to get enough input in this to sort itself out. And the trained linguist was only one of them. He had several examples. I mean, he makes a strong case that kind of all these people who have conscious learning doesn't really help them sort out their grammar. There's a lot more to discuss here in this video, but I'm giving myself a 30-minute time limit because the camera automatically shuts off after 30 minutes, and I'm just about at the edge of that time limit now. So I'm just going to shut it off here. I think I've talked for long enough.